Hi, we're going to talk today about social justice and civil rights and starting out our discussion on that. So to do that, I'm going to show you a brief and pretty quick overview of some of the primary laws and policies that have been created in regards to social justice and civil rights. So first of all, let's talk about what social justice and civil rights is. So when we look at civil rights, this basically are the rights that people have because they're members of a society. So African Americans, women, LGBTQ, their rights that they're entitled to and protected and guaranteed by law. Social justice, on the other hand, is an action of ensuring that people have those basic rights and opportunities. And so social justice is more an action, and civil rights is more the actual right to which people are entitled. So when we look at social work, it is actually in our code of ethics that we work on behalf of social justice. So how do we do that? We work for social change on behalf of our clients, and our clients often represent the most vulnerable and marginalized individuals in our society. Unlike some professions, that is in our code of ethics. So what are some of the barriers to social justice? Well, obviously one is prejudice. What is prejudice? That's an attitude of judging another group based on misconceptions that someone might have. Discrimination, though, is actually the action. So the prejudice is the attitude, and then discrimination is the action. And that's treating people differently because of the attitudes that one holds. And institutional discrimination is when we build those actions into the norms of an institution and enforce those. Well, what's oppression? Oppression is systemic and pervasive discrimination or mistreatment of people. So prejudice is the belief, discrimination is the action, and oppression then it becomes systematic and pervasive. Let's talk a little bit about barriers to social justice. Racism, and when we talk about racism, we also talk about institutional racism. So that is institutional racism is associated with public policies and institutions. So we've basically made it intentional, even though it may appear to be race neutral. So you'll see people talking about institutional racism. Well, also people are talking about structural racism. And that's when we actually put racist ideas into various policies or institutional policies. So if we look at racism being the belief that one race is superior to another, and then we put it into our institutions and policies, we are then building institutional or structural racism. Sexism is very similar to that, and although it's discrimination or thinking that one's sex is superior to another, and primarily this has been in reference to women. So feminism is the policy and economics of social equality, and misogyny is hatred of or contempt for women or girls as a group. Homophobia is unreasonable fear or antipathy towards homosexuality, and LGBTQ, as you probably know, is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. The Q might be questioning, might be queer. So there's a lot of discussion about that lately, and we're going to talk more about that. Classism is a discriminatory attitude against different social classes ethnocentrism is the superiority, believing in the superiority of an ethnic group or culture. Xenophobia is a hatred or fear of foreigners. And ageism is a belief in the superiority of youth over age. So the foundation of civil rights in our country is found in the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. What that does is it outlines the powers of the federal government. It provides rights and protections of citizens, and any new laws have to be consistent with the Constitution. Thus, when we talk about whether something is constitutional or not. The United States Supreme Court provides a final determination on a law. So there's the ones that say, yes, this law is in sync with the Constitution, or no, it is not. So we'll be talking a little bit more because Supreme Court decisions have the power of law. So when we talk about some of the laws that have been passed to guarantee civil rights, probably the most well-known and of those is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So that was passed after lots of upheaval in the 1960s. You're going to be looking at some materials in this module related to the history of passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. In 1998, the Hate Crimes Act was passed, and that also came out of a period of tremendous strife. James Byrd was an African-American that was beaten and dragged behind a truck by white supremacists. And it also pertained to Matthew Shepard, who was a gay college student beaten and tied to a fence to die. And so these terrible things came about, and the Hate Crimes Act was passed. Well, going back to 1920, because we're going to talk about some laws pertaining to women's rights, the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, giving women the right to vote. And it was in 1972 then that Title IX was passed and talks about equality in education. So basically anything that's provided to men in education also needs to be provided to women. So it applies to both academics in university settings as well as sports. In 1973, Roe versus Wade was passed, and this legalized abortion. But really more fundamentally what it did is it talked about, it's based on the right to privacy. And so that's what subsequent Supreme Court decisions have been based on, is basically that government does not have a right to regulate people's reproduction. And so that is what this law is based on. The Violence Against Women's Act was passed in 1994. It's been amended quite a few times since then. And this was really a recognition of the pervasive domestic violence and providing funding and other services to protect victims of domestic violence. The Family and Medical Leave Act was passed in 1993, and this provides rights to people so that they can take time off due to the birth or adoption of a child, and this has been extended since then to other things as well. And in 2009, there was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which was passed. Going on from there, then looking at protection from discrimination specifically, the Americans with Disabilities Act extended for the very first time employment or equality to people who were disabilities in terms of employment, public accommodations, transportation. It made a pretty dramatic change in how it is we treated disabled people in this country. Pretty amazing act. In 2015, there was a Supreme Court decision. There had been many decisions and laws prior to them related to gay marriage. And in 2015, the Supreme Court decided that gay people could be married, and that decision then overrode all state laws that prohibited it. And just in 2020, there was a further Supreme Court decision that said that the Civil Rights Act does protect LGBTQ from discrimination in employment. This is pretty major because the rights of LGBTQ had not been protected as in terms of the interpretation in the Constitution. In the 1980s and 1990s, and really before then, it's been going on for a very long time, there's been a lot of just contentious conversation about legal versus illegal immigration from Mexico and Central America. And it was really fueled by 9/11 and the bombings that happened, and the fear then that people had, I might even say the xenophobia people had. And so there has been a lot of discussion and dialogue related to the rights and of immigrants, both legal immigrants, illegal immigrants, and also, of course, probably one of the things you're most familiar with is DACA, which has to do with young people who were brought here when they were children, and do they have a right to be here even though they are not citizens, but they've grown up here. In 2010, Arizona actually passed a state law that was the most restrictive immigration law in the country. And in 2012, the Supreme Court struck down much of the key provisions, but I think the onus of the anti-immigration sentiment stayed with it. And when we look at the issues related to Native Americans, there really has been a 500-year history of treaties broken, and I could probably do a whole talk just about that. We've talked a little bit about the Dawes Act, which transferred 90 million acres of land from Native Americans to white Americans. And there's been a lot of subsequent acts. In 1978 was the Indian Child Welfare Act. So there's been a whole history of contention between Native Americans and primarily the federal government that continues to today. So that's just a brief overview of some of the laws, and you'll be looking more at these in the modules to come. So I hope that you got something out of this, and I look forward to